I'm Allie. I'm 22 now, and I went on testosterone when I think I was about to turn 19. So yeah, I think it was a couple months before my 19th birthday. I started on. I've still got a bottle of it here. It is, I think, some of like the newer kind of wave of transitioners will recognize this. I never injected. I was a testosterone gel patient. I was given that when I was 19 years old. I was on it for just over a year and a half before I detransitioned in lockdown. And I'm autistic. And since coming to the conclusion that the whole trans wasn't for me, I really started delving into what actually led me to transitioning in the first place. And me and my partner went through a billion different discussions about this until one day, when I was 20 years old, I was basically confirmed that I was autistic. And this is something that, as you mentioned before, a lot of transitioners, a lot of people who fall into, as Helena mentioned, the whole idea of fandoms, a lot of these girls do fall under the umbrella of being neurodivergent. So this is basically just anybody who has some sort of neurodevelopmental disorder, whether it might be autism spectrum disorder or Asperger's. I know people don't tend to use that word anymore, but some people still, classify themselves as being Asperger's, whether it's ADHD, which I know a few people from Twitter have mentioned in the past that they have ADHD, or Tourette's and things like that. I think it's a lot of the time it's these girls that do tend to fall into, and again, I'm saying girls, not too sure about the guys. I know it sounds crazy. I have never met a male detransitioner. I think I might, again, have some like Twitter mutuals that might be, but I've never personally spoke to any. So when I talk about this, it's very much in relation to females. So I think it's a lot of the time these females who do tend to fall down this rabbit hole of gender transition. And I actually went and researched this a little bit because I was kind of curious off my own back, like, how common actually is this for autism and trans identity to sort of overlap? And I've literally got it in front of me now that according to a study done last year by Cambridge University, transgender people are like 3 to 6 times more likely than the average population to have some form of neurodivergence like autism, ADHD, etc. So it's a really big factor that it's really important to understand what this connection is. So for me personally, after all the digging that I did, I sort of came to a few different conclusions as to what this was all about. So yeah, when I was younger, I was a very masculine child. I was raised in a very masculine environment. And again, this isn't something that everyone can relate to, I don't know, but I was pretty much raised from childhood by my dad and my 2 older brothers. And then from my teenage years, when I met my boyfriend, my current boyfriend, when I was 13, he pretty much, Jesus took the wheel after that. So my whole life, I was very much surrounded with a lot of male influence. And even when I started at school, I really struggled to make any sort of female bonded connections. Like, female friends were really out of reach for me. I remember even on my very first day of school, I literally walked in on my first day of reception at 4 years old and immediately ran off over into like the boys group, like playing football. I was a very sort of, I don't know, because I was a very creative, feely child, but I also wasn't feminine. I didn't really care for like groovy chick. I didn't really care for Barbie or Bratz. I thought it was all kind of, boring. I just want to play football. So I was very much that way inclined. I always struggled to get along with girls. And I think a big part of this was in relation to the autism symptoms, because one big thing I think about male and female friendships that I learned from a very young age, and actually was sort of instilled in me right from like this primary school era, was that there's a lot of social rules, okay, to female friendships. I think we can all admit it. male friendships to me were just so much easier. There wasn't all these rules about, oh, you can't wear the same outfit as me, or you can't talk to her because I fell out with her. You know, with the guys, we'd fall out, we'd fight, we'd make up, we'd forget about it the next day. And when you've got autism, one of the major symptoms of autism is this struggle with socializing, this struggle with social communication, context, cues. And when you've got all these added in factors of female socialization and the way that girls are raised to be in friendships with one another, you know, it's all very competitive. I think being brought up as a girl, you're brought up to kind of value like your beauty and, oh, don't get your dress muddy and things like that. Whereas as a child, I just could not deal with that sort of thing. So I ended up sort of falling into these very male friend groups, which to this day I am still in. So all of the friends I made in high school, I am still friends with now. We are also like the bestest friends, and they're very understanding people. So I think right from the get-go, I was very sort of outcasted and very sort of secluded from female friendship groups. And this is what formed the basis to me believing I should be a man. And I even sort of tweeted about this today. I did mention it sort of in a very tongue-in-cheek way that, you know, like, oh, I was tired of not fitting in with girls my whole life. I had this issue where I didn't know how to bond with girls. I didn't know how to, you know, replicate, because a lot of autistic people, we don't sort of, the way I've always explained it, and I was literally talking to my boyfriend about this before, right, before I like went ahead and did all this. One thing that I mentioned is that autistic people aren't really born with the instruction manual, like the built-in instruction manual that neurotypical people are, of how to form those social bonds. So for me, a big part of it was about replication and about copying people. And for me, just because of the way that male friendships seem to be a lot easier and they seem to be a lot more blunt, they seem to be a lot less emotional, it was a lot easier for me to then fall into those male friendship groups and to copy and replicate that male behavior. And this was another part of the autism that sort of overlaps with my idea of transition. So you have me as a child, you know, 5 or 6 years old, playing football with boys. I was on an all boys team up until the age of 12. I don't think I went to a female sleepover until I was about 11. I was literally copying these boys. And so what happens is when day in, day out, you're socializing with your dad, you're socializing with your rough, rowdy older brothers, you're socializing with your male football team, is I would even pick up their traits and their mannerisms. So, you know, how girls tend to sit, you know, little cross-legged, things like that. I would, you know, legs apart, man spreading, I would be straight up copying them. Even the way they spoke, as much as I hate to admit it now, I mean, I'm a bisexual girl, so this is going to make more sense. When I started developing sort of more, you know, romantic sexual feelings, I conducted that in the way that is very typical of male socialization. Oh my God, look at her, she's well fit. You know what I mean? It was, you know, it wasn't like how Helena was mentioning earlier, where it was like this deep-seated, unrequited love crush on a, you know, very female-friendly male sort of character or celebrity. It was very, and again, I'm going to sound so gross. I am so sorry, but it makes sense. It was all very, you know, page 3 girls, internet porn, things like that. So even the way that my sexuality developed was very typical of the way that a male sexuality would then go on to develop. So over time, all of this added up to a very like deep-seated feeling within me that I am not supposed to be a girl. I don't get on with girls. I don't have any of the interests of girls. I behave like a man. I act like a man. I'm attracted to women in the way that men are. To me, in my head, the only possible conclusion was that I was meant to be a boy. Like there is no way. Like in my head, I used to say to my boyfriend all the time, I remember us very specifically sitting on this bed and me being like, I just don't get it. Like I have a male brain, and I'm going to get onto that as well at some point, the whole concept of a male brain, because that is one thing that got into my head. So I started having these feelings. Like I say, I was about 11, 12 at this point, where I was very, very convinced I'm meant to be a boy. There is no way I do not get on with girls. It just does not make any sense. So I was having all these issues with, you know, social problems that autism causes, you know, the sort of general introversion, being sort of very quiet at school, not really, you know, branching out of what was my comfort zone. And so, as Helena mentioned before, I discovered the wonderful land of the internet, Tumblr, YouTube. Teenage me fell in love with the likes of, and you might have heard a few of these names, maybe not if you were very involved in these circles, the likes of Calvin Garra, Blair White, sort of like what we would consider trans medicalists. So people who believe that you are born transgender, that there are some people who in the womb, they were born wrong. You were meant to have developed male, and by some fault or accident or whatever, you were accidentally born female. And so I fell in love. Like, like teenage me was like, oh my God, this is the answer. This is it. I'm gender dysphoric. I was meant to be born male. There's no other reason why I might struggle to get along with women. There's no other reason. It's because I'm meant to be a boy. And so at this point, I started really like, you know, divulging into that. I started experimenting quite a lot with like my gender presentation. I remember the funniest thing is like I went to the supermarket with my dad once. I picked up like some male deodorant and I put it in the trolley. And my dad was like, that's for guys. And I was like, yeah, I know, you know, like suck it to your dad. Like I know what I want. And on Tumblr and on Instagram, I changed my pronouns to he/she. I thought I was like some form of gender fluid, maybe, because I kind of thought at the time the concept of transitioning was too scary. It was too much. I was only 13, 14 at this point, and, you know, I wasn't sure enough about myself. And plus, all these new words and all these new terms in like 2014 had just come out, you know, like online there was like these very new sort of phrases like non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer. And I was like, I'm gender fluid. That is what I am, because some days I want to be girly, other days I want to dress like a man. So I did that. I, you know, kind of brought it into a school setting. I remember telling my a couple of teachers, because there is no greater relationship between an autistic girl and her English teacher. They are like two peas in a pod. So I remember telling my English teacher at the time and sort of opening up to her, being like, oh, I don't know if I really feel like I'm supposed to be a girl. Like, I feel like I was meant to be born a boy, but I'm not sure. I keep changing in my head. And it got to that point when I was in high school where I was in my final year. I sat my GCSEs or like my final exams, whatever. And I remember saying to my boyfriend, I need to pick a side. I remember I said to him, I can't go my life flipping between being man and woman like I was doing. Like some days I would say my pronouns are he today and I'm a boy today, and my pronouns are she today, I'm a girl today. And I would do that. I would flip-flop around like crazy, right? And I said to him, I need to settle on one before I go to college, because my voice just broke, testosterone things. But yeah, I said to him, when I go to college, I don't want to be, you know, bullied for this. I don't want to be like confusing people. And so I bit the bullet at that point. I swallowed my dysphoria and went, fine, for the next 2 years of my life, I'm just going to present as girly as possible. I'm just going to try and blend in. I'm just going to try and be totally normal. And on top of that, there was also like, this is like really put out, how personal am I allowed to get? I don't know. But on top of that, there was also a billion and one things going on in the background. This is where it all gets a little bit dark. Again, I don't know if I'm allowed to get dark, but I went through like some pretty bad like sexual abuse as a teenager. Essentially, I was like groomed online, and that's a whole other story. Like, I don't really want to fully get into. My boyfriend had like, who like, by the way, my boyfriend, like, I will come back to at some point. Like, some of you probably follow him on Twitter because he's very loud, but he is like a huge part of this narrative. He's like a massive formation of it, and the autism does link into there somewhere. So he had a whole bunch of issues. onto himself. I had a whole bunch of trauma. You know, there was all this stuff going on around me. My parents got divorced. Everything was a total mess. So for some reason, when I was like 17 and I started college, I thought the best thing to possibly do was suppress it. Just push it down. Don't think of this dysphoria. Don't think of this desire to be male. Just forget about it. And that is what I did. For 2 years, I grew my hair out super long. I wore makeup every day. I became very feminine, which for me was actually quite nice, because my whole life, I mean, when I was at school, I'd sort of been the complete opposite, where, I was like, I'm one of the guys, all my friends are dudes, and they'd sort of make fun of me, if I sort of, oh, that's stupid, that's cringe, if I showed any like feminine interest. So like a part of it was quite nice. A part of it was like, oh, I get to explore that side of things. They were all still my friends. I still had the same friend group going into college as I did in high school. And yeah, I carried on. I did that and finished college. And that's when it started. That's when I remember I finished, and the penny dropped. Something in my head when I was 18 years old, I did my last A-level exam. I suddenly decided, this is it. I need to go through with this transition, because the big narrative that is being pushed, and again, we sort of touched on this earlier, but it's this idea that trans joy is what will save you, that transition will be the answer to all of your problems. You've been feeling, outcasted and out of place, and you can't really find your place socially and things like that. And the thing with autism is, autistic people, we are very obsessive people. So if I have an interest or a passion or a hobby, I put my absolute heart into that thing. And they can be, surely some people have heard of the phrase special interest that autistic people have, where, yeah, we become absolutely ingrained and obsessed with whatever interest it is we have on that particular moment. The issue with that is that can sort of manifest itself into obsession with self and overthinking. Every therapist I've ever been to says to me, you're very introspective, aren't you? And I'm like, yeah, I'm very introspective. And I came to that conclusion that transition was the answer. There was no other solution. So I got on to google.com. I was like, I'm not waiting. So the NHS waiting times, like the National Health Service here in the UK, it's kind of a big thing that the trans community talks about, that there's like 5-6 year waiting list for things like top surgery, hormones and things like that. And I was like, F that. So I had a job at the time. I actually worked for a postal service at the time, and I saved up all my money from those paychecks to go private and get private gender treatment. And this is what angers me so much. Literally, as Sinead was mentioning before, there is no exploitative therapy. So you've all heard of Dr. Helen Weberly, right? Miss Controversial figure in the sort of gender critical trans universe. I went through her sort of gender company, Gender GP, and exploitative therapy did not exist. All I had to do in order to get hormones, and it took me from I first contacted her in March, I got hormones in June. So it took all of about 3 or 4 months to actually get access to hormones. All I had to do was pay £300, have a 30-minute consultation. They ask you a few questions like, oh, have you considered the risks about fertility, yada, yada. And I was like, yeah, tick, 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 because I was on Tumblr, I was on Instagram, I knew exactly what to say to get hormones. So I just went, tick, 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 yes, give me the fucking testosterone. And it was right there. I never had a formal diagnosis. I was never diagnosed with gender dysphoria formally. I was never given exploitative therapy. There was no discussion of all these issues, no mention of sexual trauma, no mention of, my upbringing and things like that and how that could have affected things. I had had so many issues with mental health in my life when I was in college and things like that. All throughout that time, from childhood to adulthood, there was multiple suicide attempts, there was self-harm, there was like I said before, there was all sorts of things going on, none of which were explored, none of which they did not contact my GP. It was like, looking back on it now, at the time, I was so happy that it was so simple. But now I look back and I'm like, what the hell? I was literally 18 years old and they just gave me this shit, and it's crazy. And you know what? Like, I don't know if this is like controversial to admit in like detrans circles, whatever, but for the first year or so, I was over the freaking moon. I was like, this is it. This is the answer. I changed my name to Ryan, which my parents weren't happy with, but you know, they had to get over. And for the first time, I think once I was a few months on testosterone, I was out with my friends, like the all male kind of friend group. And for once, I was like, I fit in, you know, like I'm one of the guys, I'm being treated like one of the lads. Like, nobody's like, why is that girl friends with all guys? That's kind of weird. So I kind of finally felt like, oh my God, this is it. This is the solution. So, you know, some time passed and I was on hormones and I went to university. So it was the first time in my life that when I went to university, it was the first time that I'd ever moved away from home. I'd lived in the same place my whole life, you know, proper small town kind of upbringing. And it's only when I was in university, I think that some sort of issues sort of started to arise. I remember going through a really, really bad mental health episode. And I remember I went to uni and I was completely shaken. I was like, my routine had been completely disturbed. I suddenly found myself really, really anxious. I didn't get out of bed for like 2 weeks. And I remember saying to my boyfriend, like, I have no idea what is going on. Like, I remember saying to him, like, this is just crazy. Like, I just can't settle in. I feel like I fucked my life up. And he was like, look, just like uni has like, because he's a student as well. So he's like, uni has, you know, therapists, it has disabled students kind of help and things like that. Just go there, tell them what's going on. And yeah. So long story short, I didn't get to tell them because there was one of those like great suicide attempts again when I was like 20. And it's at that point that I was actually referred to a social worker for the first time in my life, which I could have done with a lot earlier, to be honest. But I saw him, he was this guy, and I remember sitting there, like I was just in this little office. I was sat in the little student disability office, as it was called. And I remember sitting there and telling him exactly how I felt. I was like, everything feels so unfamiliar. I just can't get used to change. Like, my whole routine has been shaken. And I was telling him about all these symptoms I'd had my whole life, like this idea of this social introversion and feeling like really outcasted and just not feeling like if things aren't routine and ordered, it really messes with my head. And he was the first person who uttered the word autism. And oh my God, like while I'm on this, like this makes me think of a really important point. As a female, okay, so I've been sort of in and out of the mental health services for a long, long time. Like I mentioned, I was diagnosed with, prescribed all sorts of shit as a teenager. It's only when somebody who didn't know that I was born female, because there is a big, big, big disparity in diagnosis between female people and male people when it comes to autism. So males are far more likely to be diagnosed than females. There is sort of a crisis in the female autistic community where we're recognizing now that a lot of young women are only being diagnosed when they're in their late teens, early 20s. And when I was a teenager, words were thrown around like borderline, you know, bipolar, oh, you're manic, oh, you're just, it's hormones. Nobody, until I'd met this social worker who saw me as male and he didn't know that I was transgender, nobody had said to me, these are all symptoms of autism. And so it's only then when I started that process of researching, because it's something that had never even crossed my mind at that point. You know, I didn't know what it was. I mean, I didn't truly understand, you know, what autism was. I'd heard of it, but that's people like Harvey Price, right? Like people like me don't have autism. So I went to a doctor and I started a diagnostic process, and I began sort of going on things like TikTok and like looking for like communities of like autistic people. And it's crazy how much it started to resonate with me. And just all the little things that they said they do, even tiny things like, oh, I have to have a specific brand of food. I have to have the same meals every week. I have to have dinner at the same time every day. Even tiny little minute things like that. All of a sudden, it was just like, and I said to Lou, like, I literally like said to him the other day, it was like, you've got a load of pieces of this jigsaw. All of a sudden, it's just come together and you can just see this picture and you're like, oh my God, like literally like my life flashed before my eyes. And I was like, this is it. Like, this is what I've been looking for. And I realized once I started delving and once I started having those deep emotional conversations with him, that a lot of my dysphoria came down to the fact that I never felt like I fit in with girls. I was what they would call a pick-me. I was one of these girls who struggled to get on with other women. I was always made fun of, for always having these male friends. And I always really struggled with that socialization, and I didn't know how to sort of fit in with those groups. And once I realized that that was a huge proponent of autism, and so many other women with autism felt this way, it was like, holy shit. It was like, oh my God, this is the answer. And so I came off hormones, and I could even look on the box of this. This was the last one I was ever prescribed in May 2021. So that was the last time I ever took testosterone. And
could I ask, Allie, was there much time? Was it the social worker and the conversations with the social worker that kind of brought in the jigsaw? So the social worker helped as such? And also, could I ask,
he was really good. And like I said, this guy...
Was there much time between, let's say, the social worker's conversation and you deciding to detransition?
There was about, and I'm trying to I have the biggest goldfish memory in existence, so I always try to piece together the timelines with this. I came home from uni about December 2020. I came off hormones May 2021, so that was about 6 months. There was 6 months difference. Right. And yeah,
that seems good. Yeah,
it was a very confusing time. And I think, and I honestly think the only other thing that I want to say about autism and not detransition, more the actual initial transition, is I think it almost sort of relates to what Helena was talking about before. That there's a certain, I remember, I think it was actually Laura that wrote a thread about this on Twitter, and it was so good. I sent it to my dad. I was like, look, this explains everything in perfect detail, and it just adds up. And there's this thing with autistic girls, I think in particular, where we have a very strong sense of and not to be cringe, but a very strong sense of social justice. Oh. So I think a lot of autistic girls, are very deeply hyper empathetic. They want to kind of save the world. You see all these things going on. I was always a very political teenager. I've always been, in political parties. My dad was very left wing, and my boyfriend is very left wing. And so I was very into politics and social justice. And the trans movement is perfect for that, because you've got a group of people who, they're oppressed. The government's trying to strip their rights away. And it's like, oh my God, this is an awful, awful thing that's happening. And if you're a very naturally compassionate, naturally hyper empathetic person who cares about social justice and social reform and things like that, the sort of trans community is perfect for you, because you're given this feeling like you're doing something to help, that you're an activist. And as much as I never bought, like I said, I was more of a trans medicalist. I never bought into the idea of non-binary and things like that. I still felt that there was this thing where these people are an oppressed minority, we're being cornered by governments and far-right hate groups and things like that. And for somebody who, is very sort of passionate about that sort of thing, it's this perfect breeding ground for feeling like you're making a difference while also being accepted into a community. Trans people, a lot of people who transition, they also feel like they're very shunned out of society and things like that. So it's almost as if you find this perfect social group to fit into as well. And there was just so many things about it that, to me, it just felt so perfect. I always say, as weird as it sounds, I know a lot of people use the word regret. Personally, I never really use that terminology, because I don't regret the fact that I transitioned. I think it was something that if I didn't do it, it would have niggled on my brain forever. I think if I didn't go on testosterone, I would have wondered my entire life if that was the answer. So, in a sense, I'm glad that I did it. I'm glad that I went through that process because now I know that that isn't the answer. But a big part of me also wishes that those symptoms, those signs, those cues, even the motor difficulties, the delayed speech, I think part of me was mad at my parents because I think, how do you fucking miss that? You know what I mean? Like, your child has autism, you don't bother taking them to a doctor, you don't bother doing anything about this. And I think a lot of my anger was sort of around that. I think obviously at the clinicians that had seen me in my teen years who didn't pick up on any of those symptoms. I think, there was a lot of anger. Like, when I first came off hormones, there was a lot of deep upset. There was like a lot of tears. There was a lot of worrying about fertility. That was my one big reason. Actually, I'd say the main reason I initially looked at reducing the dose of testosterone I was on, or sort of backing away from transition, was because I've literally always wanted kids my entire life. And the longer I was in this sort of committed relationship, the more and more I wanted those children. And that was a big driver. So there was just like so many factors. Like, there was so much that made me think, oh, this isn't right for me. And that's the thing, is it's not the answer for everyone. I think the problem is that the trans community and the trans ideology narrative in general is that transition or die. Like, literally, me and Lou talk about this all the time. We see it on Twitter, on Tumblr, on TikTok, all the time, that if you don't transition, you're going to be depressed, miserable. Oh, if trans kids can't get hormones, they're going to kill themselves. And at that point in my life, when I felt like that, when I was just this sad, autistic, lonely little girl, I thought, if I don't get these hormones, like, I'm just going to be miserable and suicidal forever, and that's it. Like, this is the only solution. And it really screwed with my head. And I think we need a serious rethink of how we sort of market these ideas, because it's leading a lot of girls like me, and a lot of boys as well, probably, into thinking that it's the only solution for that feeling of like outcast and that feeling of I'm meant to be something that I wasn't born as.